Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you can see, today's topic is a continuation of our topic regarding World War II. This will include renewed racism and, of course, resistance. Now, I want to, as always, take a moment, tell you to hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, why, be able to connect them to each other and their larger historical significance. You got it? Let's get started. Now, before we really begin here, I want to recap some things from the last lecture regarding the Bracero program. Not the entire thing, obviously, but I do want to recap some of those specific legacies or impacts of the program, because it's also going to impact Mexicanos in the United States heavily. And so I want to start there. And remember, the process was that the Mexican men themselves became actors on an international stage where they were performing this role and transforming themselves into a dumb, docile, humble Indian whose only function in life appeared, according to the U.S. inspectors, as that of a farm migrant stoop laborer. And so this, of course, was a godsend when it came for U.S. growers. You have a migrant proletariat on contract labor who will come into the country, work, perform labor as cheap, exploitable, disposable labor, and then leave. Often living in poor housing, poor pay, with no fundamental rights, no chance at citizenship, no chance for voting. And then, of course, in addition to this, is the process itself beyond being accepted, because then you're deloused, presuming that you are disease-ridden, dirty, going to spread disease to the Anglo-American population. And what it does, as I said last time, it changes and constructs a very one-dimensional construction of the term Mexican. It transforms Mexican people into a commodity function and utility that devalues anything and everything that would hold value to Mexican people. The individual self, the family, the culture, the political experience, history. And it created a negative definition or referent, equating Mexican culture, the Mexican person, with nothing more than a seasonal stoop labor. And of course, as thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of Mexicans enter the United States as these braceros, yes, there's an economic benefit to it, but that negative referent that comes to define the Mexican is going to create increased violence and racism throughout the country. Then adding to this negative stereotypical definition of braceros was a more radical element among Mexican Americans known as Unión Nacional Sinarquista, or the Sinarquista movement. And this was a fascist organization that was made up of Mexican Americans. I mentioned this a couple lectures ago. Fascism, the Nazi Party, was prevalent in the United States. Remember, the United States was still dealing with the Great Depression. And there were those who recommended, we talked about, that the president take on at least temporary dictator powers. And so it should come as no surprise that while the communist movement was prevalent, so was Nazism or fascism. And there was a large movement that would hold large outdoor rallies in places like Los Angeles and New York City, holding essentially party conventions. Now, they would employ this propaganda campaign And they would specifically target the United States' racial minority groups, whipping up animosity between Mexicans, Mexican Americans, and the US government. They would promote things like civil disorder. And they were paying special attention to the conditions of African Americans and especially Mexican Americans that had a strong foothold in places like El Paso and, of course, Los Angeles. And it would spread across the country. And because they were, fascist, and they believed that the government of the United States was not doing the right things, they attempted to sabotage Mexican American support for the war by telling Mexican Americans, don't enlist, don't purchase war bonds, don't serve in the USOs, do not work in wartime defense industries. They challenged the Bracero program, claiming that the United States would conscript Mexican laborers into the armed forces, which of course was against the Bracero program rules, but it's happened before. And while it will fail to achieve the majority of its goals, some impact did happen. There was some people who would be dissuaded from helping the war effort as a result. And while inherently Mexican Americans would oppose fascism, the damage was done. Because again, most Anglo-Americans did not distinguish between average, everyday, Mexicanos and the Braceros, or the more radical elements such as the Sinarquista movement. And they only lumped them all together as the Mexican. And the result of this was creating segregation, continued disenfranchisement, housing discrimination, miscegenation laws where you could not marry across ethno-racial groups, little to no access for health care, environmental racism, where if you're going to build a dump, you build it in the Mexican neighborhood. If you're going to pollute in their neighborhood, who cares? And of course, police brutality. And there was one more element to this, and that was the Mexicano youth, who were not necessarily radical like the Sinarquistas. They were definitely not braceros. They were not usually working in the fields. These were urban Mexicano youth. And this is fully entrenched in the 1940s. This is a fully entrenched Mexican American generation. Remember, the start of the 1920s, we talked about that with the Roaring '20s and the Jazz Age and all those Mexican American youths coming of age to fight for civil rights. Well, this is now 20 years later. There's kind of an interlude there thanks to the repatriation in the 1930s with the Great Depression. But by the 40s, this is a firmly entrenched Mexican American generation who want to fully embody their rights as U.S. citizens, but are simultaneously experiencing the traditional U.S. teenage angst. They're seeing their parents shipped off to war. They're experiencing harsh racism at home. They're experiencing discrimination, being viewed as Anglos as merely farm workers, as being disease-ridden, and as possibly as radicals like the Sinarquistas. In an outgrowth of this pushback by the Mexicano youth was a protest and identity that manifested itself in their clothing style choices. Remember, this is not something that should be unusual. Every generation has a unique style, or its unique take on style becomes inherently theirs. Whether it's the bell bottoms of the 70s, the long hair of the hippies, whether it is some of the worst dressed clothing of the 80s and 90s, the big old hair of the 80s. Well, this is not something unusual in history. Every generation has it. But these Mexican American youths, at least the most high profile manifestation of it, was a trend that grew in Los Angeles. And these Mexicano youth would embrace a new form of fashion culture that would help them to lay claim to their cultural identity. And it became strongly associated with Mexicano youths. Was a popular style that was not just for Mexicanos, but for Asians, African Americans, and some working class whites. And yes, I'm talking about the Zoot Suit, a fashion statement or mode of dress that conveyed a message, that featured a long suit coat, featured baggy pleated pants with tapered at the ankle, fancy shoes with double soles, long chain hanging down from the coat down to their pants, styled hair that was slicked back in a hip ducktail. It was believed to have originated in the black jazz musicians of the 20s and 30s. Again, note the problematic nature here of racial mixing. Now, of course, the male zoot suiter was known as a Pachuco. The term is believed to have originated in El Paso, Texas. Now, for these minority groups, it was about claiming identity and dignity. Some did so to voice their displeasure with being viewed as second-class citizens. Some did it by joining the military. Or some would voice their displeasure by being the best jitterbugger in town. So there's various ways you can respond to racism and discrimination. One is by fighting back. One is by protesting. One is by joining civil rights groups. Another is just by simply trying to act the way you want to act by virtue of the right you have as a citizen. In this case, being the best dancer at the jitterbug. In this case, dressing how they want to. And many non-white youth began to deal with this displacement and dehumanization by acquiring, creating, and practicing a style that they identified or that identified them as being cool. Acquiring a zoot suit was considered a rite of passage into coolness. For instance, Malcolm X, the future civil rights leader, remembers doing various jobs, including shining shoes so he could afford one. It was expensive, especially for a tailor-made one. Even off-the-rack designs were costly. And while mail-order ones were cheaper, especially many women would make it their own. And in doing so, zoot suiters were participating in the growing wartime consumer economy. And so while some Mexicanos would try to claim whiteness to fit in and be accepted, zoot suiters were claiming otherness. They were saying, we are different, but we are proud of that difference. We are proud of being other. Again, this is a normal teenage thing for, well, even US teenagers, Anglo teenagers. But what was created was a distinct Mexican American identity. The zoot and jazz cultures offered a glimpse into a world where ideas about race and sex and labor were not always regulated by the state, the wartime economy, or the dominant Anglo culture. It created a new possibility where novel social relations could exist. In other words, it was a chance to be free and accepted by others like them. And hey, blow off some steam from all the stress and issues of society of a world war while race mixing. And by the way, guys, this was not just limited to males. This also included Pachucos, the female zoot suiter, often referred to as malinchistas by their more conservative parents. Remember the story of La Malinche, being a betrayer of the people, right? This was the old idea, these malinchistas. They were referred to by the more conservative generation, their parents, other conservatives, as being betrayers of the race or the culture of the people. These young women blatantly rebelled against social conventions, considered traitors to proper female behavior with their hypersexuality, that brought shame to the people. They were going to dance clubs, mixing with boys and other races, going unchaperoned, experiencing their own sexual awakening. But on a higher level, they were getting political, facing their 3 times minority status. Remember, they are seen as being outsiders, as being, Mexicans or Mexican Americans. Second minority status, they're women. It's already a separate category in U.S. society. And then they're a minority within their own group as both a female and now as a Pachuca. More than just a fashion rebel, the wartime Pachuca represented an important symbolic site on which debates regarding the changing social landscape of the war years unfolded. As one historian on the Zoot Suit noted, using the style and behavior as a way to challenge ideas of respectability, to assert their own distinctive identity, Pachucas defied mainstream notions of proper feminine decorum, as well as the traditional definitions of Mexican femininity. The historian went on to say that as a woman's social roles broadened more generally, the Mexican family struggled to maintain a hold on its daughters. The Pachuca came to represent a female figure whose dangerous sexuality demanded restraint. All the more dangerous was how Pachucas seemingly mixed their blatant sexuality with a politicized identity of Mexican American womanhood. Pachucas not only embraced a persona that celebrated cultural difference, but many embraced a persona that felt no qualms about expressing discontent with second-class citizenship. In other words, this historian is saying they were challenging the Mexicano patriarchy as Mexicanos. They were challenging their second-class status as Mexican Americans. And they were challenging the larger American patriarchy as women, following the same techniques as the flappers of the 1920s. Oh, and they were militant. Even when confined to juvenile detention centers, Mexican American women would often engage rebelliously in performative aspects of their public cultural identities. Numerous court cases filed suggested the dismay of probation officers as they were troubled over Mexican American women's insistence on altering the uniforms, their prison uniforms, of various reform institutions to more resemble Pachuca attire. The result of this became known as Pachuquismo, or Zoot Suiterisms. It was a cultural phenomenon that thrived in the major urban centers, created massive anxiety among non-Mexican American population, and created major anxiety among the older Mexican American population. It reflected a dissatisfaction among the youth with the old-fashioned ways of their parents, much like the flappers of the 1920s. Why? Because it rebels against the mainstream social norms, as these Mexican American youth begin to gravitate towards swing music and swing dance to differentiate themselves from the traditional music of their parents' generation. Remember, youth always want to rebel against their parents' music. And of course, the parents never understand that newfangled music. It was jazz in the 20s. This is, the swing dances of the 40s, rock and roll of the 50s, the gangster rap of the 80s and 90s. This is always rebelling against the parent generation of music. And thus, all of these leisure activities that appeal to these second generation Mexican American women, listening and dancing to the big bands, became a youthful fad and favorite pastime. One Pachuca, Connie Rivera, for instance, remembered distinctly disliking her parents' parties because those old fogies, as she referred to them, listened to Mexican music, whereas she preferred the jitterbug. Significantly, swing music and dance made possible what one scholar termed the democratization of the dance hall culture, facilitating greater interaction and intimacy between whites, Mexicans, blacks, and Asians within these urban spaces. They shared style as well as space, including dance halls and movie theaters and street corners, and while challenging segregation in the process. And of course, this was concerning to the Anglo population. This is a continuation of the Jazz Age of the 1920s, just a new round of it. Also vital was their language. Every generation of youth have their own distinct lingo. Again, for instance, the word cool or hot. They have different connotations depending on what age you are. And the lingo of the Pachucos and Pachucas were no different. The slang of the Pachucos were known as calo. Calo is a hybrid language that was influenced by Zincalo, a dialect of Spanish gypsies, Hispanicized English, Anglicized Spanish, and indigenous language such as Nahuatl. Calo was popularized in the 1940s in the United States by working class Mexican American youths. Now, while there was growing public resentment regarding the Zoot Suit style and culture, Calo became associated with Pachuco gang life, known as a language that was only recognized by its members. The use of Calo by the Mexican youth was an act of defiance and resistance, representing the refusal of Mexican youth to assimilate to the U.S. culture, signifying their determination to create a legitimate national identity as both American and Mexican. It is filled with code switching between English and Spanish. I put a couple on there for you. So bolillo, Anglo or white boy. Simón, which means yes or some type of approval. Or ponte truca, which means watch out, be careful. In all of this, every bit of this, from the clothes to the hair to the lingo, was a form of protest that had its origins in the poverty-stricken barrios. It was a way to defy normal Anglo society and to oppose the war. Remember, it took a lot of excess clothing to make a zoot suit at a time of rationing during World War II. It represented resentment over racism and classism. For men, Pachuquismo was a way to exhibit manly prowessness. And for women, it was about gender blurring and sexual liberation. And yes, while some in the African American and Mexicano communities would buy war bonds or push for Americanization, demanding civil rights or claiming whiteness, Zoot Suiters mobilized a different way to protest through the body politics of dignity. Pachucos experimented with what amounted to a politics of the possible, in which Zoot Suiters explored the possibilities and limits of wartime race and gender identities. They were being political in how they dressed. This was an act of disobedience against the norm. Now, it's one thing to say all this. It's another thing to live it, because the reality is there will be a strong, staunch pushback against this Pachuco culture. But that's a topic for the second half of this lecture. So until then, take care and bye-bye.